May 1, 1982, roughly 30,000 feet above the cold grey water of the South Atlantic. A young Argentine Air Force pilot named Carlos Perona sat in the cockpit of a Mirage 3, one of the fastest interceptors of its generation. Below him, somewhere in the haze around the Falkland Islands, was a British fleet that his country insisted had no business being there. Perona had trained for exactly this. His aircraft could exceed twice the speed of sound. It was sleek, supersonic, and on paper, it was superior to anything the Royal Navy could put into the sky. The thing the Royal Navy had put into the sky was a stubby little jet with a flat nose and a single engine. It could not even break the sound barrier in level flight. Perona had been taught that speed was life. He had been taught that a faster aircraft dictates the fight, that it chooses when to attack and when to leave. By every figure in the manuals, the Mirage 3 should have been able to climb away from this strange British aeroplane whenever it wished. Then a missile left one of those British jets, and Perona's Mirage came apart around him. He ejected. He survived. And in the months that followed, Argentine pilots up and down the chain would keep asking a version of the same question. How did a subsonic jump jet, an aircraft half the world had written off as a gimmick, win a war in the air against faster machines and lose nothing in return? That question is the spine of this story. The Sea Harrier flew into the Falklands conflict with the odds, the physics, and the opinion of most experts stacked against it. It came out with at least 20 Argentine aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, and not a single one of its own lost to an enemy fighter. To understand how that happened, we cannot start in 1982. We have to start with an idea that almost no one believed in, an idea about an aircraft that could stop in mid-air. The Harrier began as a question that sounded absurd in the late 1950s. What if a fast jet did not need a runway at all? What if you could point its engine thrust downward, lift the whole machine straight off the ground, and then redirect that thrust to fly forward? The concept came from a French engineer, Michel Vibeau, and it was turned into a working engine by the Bristol Company in England, with Sir Stanley Hooker among the men who made the vectored thrust engine real. Hawker built an experimental aircraft around it, called the P-1127. By 1969, the Royal Air Force had a strange new machine in service, called the Harrier. Almost everyone treated it as a curiosity. A jet that could hover was a marvel at an air show, but a serious fighter was supposed to be fast, and the Harrier was not. Critics argued that a subsonic aircraft could never survive against supersonic opponents. They said it was too slow to fight and too short range to matter. The Royal Navy came to it almost by accident. In the 1960s, Britain cancelled its large aircraft carriers to save money. The Navy was left building smaller ships it was not even allowed to call carriers, in case the word frightened the Treasury into cancelling those too. To fly from these small decks, the Navy developed a version of the Harrier with a radar in the nose and a fighter's weapons. They called it the Sea Harrier. It entered service around 1980, and a small number of pilots began working out exactly what it could and could not do. What they discovered in training would later astonish two air forces. One of those pilots was Commander Nigel Ward, known to everyone as Sharky. Before the war, he and his squadron flew mock combat against some of the best fighters in the Western world. They fought American F-5 aggressor jets and came out far ahead. They fought F-15 Eagles, one of the finest fighters ever built, and still won the exchanges. Ward later wrote that against the F-15, he and another pilot recorded 7 kills for and just 1 against. The reason was a piece of physics that the speed charts hid. A delta-winged interceptor like the Mirage is wonderful in a straight line. But when it hauls into a hard turn, that big triangular wing creates enormous drag, and the aircraft bleeds away its speed and its energy. The Sea Harrier was light, it had a powerful engine for its size, and it turned tightly without washing off energy the same way. In a close-turning fight at lower speeds, the slow British jet could outturn the fast Argentine ones. The numbers that mattered in a dogfight were not the numbers in the brochure. Now we come to the part of the story that legend has distorted, and getting it right is the whole point. For decades, people have claimed the Sea Harrier won by viffing. Viffing means vectoring in forward flight, swiveling the engine nozzles in the middle of a fight to brake suddenly so a pursuer overshoots. It is a real capability. It makes a thrilling story. And in the Falklands, it was essentially never used in air combat. The pilots have said so plainly. David Morgan, the most successful British pilot of the war, stated that no one used viffing during the conflict because it was a defensive trick and the Sea Harriers were never on the defensive. They were the hunters. So if it was not the hover trick and it was not raw speed, what actually did the killing? The honest answer is a missile. The United States supplied Britain with its newest short-range weapon, the all-aspect Sidewinder, the AIM-9 Lima. Earlier heat-seeking missiles had to be fired from behind a target, chasing the hot exhaust. The all-aspect Sidewinder could lock on from the front, the side, almost any angle at all. This changed everything. An Argentine pilot could no longer feel safe, simply because no enemy was on his tail. The British jets no longer needed to win a long turning duel to get into a firing position. They needed only a glimpse. The results were brutal in their efficiency. Of the roughly 20 air-to-air kills the Sea Harriers achieved, the large majority were made with that one missile. Contemporary sources agree that 24 of these Sidewinders were fired during the campaign, and 21 struck their targets. That is a hit rate of about 88%. To grasp how staggering that was, compare it with the Vietnam War, where an earlier Sidewinder achieved a kill probability closer to 18%. Britain had not just brought a good missile, it had brought a weapon a generation ahead of what its enemy could answer. The fighting began in earnest on May 1, 1982, the same day Carlos Perona was shot down. A Royal Air Force pilot flying with the Navy, Flight Lieutenant Paul Barton, scored the first British air-to-air kill since the Korean War. A second Mirage, flown by Captain Gustavo Garcia Cuerva, was damaged and then destroyed by Argentina's own anti-aircraft gunners as it tried to limp home to Stanley. The man died to friendly fire while fleeing an enemy he could not shake. That single grim afternoon told the Argentine High Command something it did not want to hear. Sending their best interceptors over the islands meant losing them, so they made a fateful decision. After May 1st, the Mirage 3 force was largely pulled back to defend the Argentine mainland. The fastest fighters Argentina possessed effectively withdrew from the contest for the sky over the Falklands. That left the slower attack jets, the Daggers, and the Skyhawks to run the gauntlet alone. And the gauntlet they faced was not only the Sea Harrier, it was geography. The Argentine jets flew from bases on the mainland, more than 400 miles from the islands. That distance sat right at the edge of their range. After the long flight out, many fighters had only 5 to 12 minutes over the target before they had to turn for home or run out of fuel. They could not loiter. They could not pick the richest target. They often had to attack the first ship they saw and flee. The Mirages and Daggers had no aerial refueling at all, and the entire force depended on just 2 tanker aircraft. Worse, the attack pilots flew nearly blind to danger. Their aircraft carried no radar warning receiver, no device to tell a pilot that an enemy had locked onto him. One Argentine commander, Pablo Carballo, recounted that their planes had no warning gear at all. They flew into the most dangerous airspace of their lives, unable to hear the danger coming. Set all of this beside the men they were fighting. The British pilots were superbly trained. They had practiced this exact kind of combat for years, and they were now equipped with a missile that turned a fleeting glimpse into a kill. The Argentine airmen were brave to the point of recklessness, and the British said so repeatedly. One British paratrooper admitted that at first they thought the Argentine pilots were mad, and that as the war went on, they came to respect them as utterly professional men doing a near-impossible job. But courage cannot rewrite fuel math, and it cannot conjure a missile your country does not own. The busiest day came on May 21st, during the British landings at San Carlos. As waves of Argentine jets swept in low over the water to attack the ships, the Sea Harriers fell on them. On that single day, British jets destroyed about 10 enemy aircraft. Sharkey Ward chased down a small Argentine turboprop and fired so many cannon rounds into it that he watched roughly 20 strikes flash across its frame before it went down. That pilot, Carlos Tomba, ejected, survived, was captured, and later helped the British as an interpreter. The last aerial victories of the war came on June 8 at Bluff Cove. Argentine Skyhawks had just struck British landing ships, with terrible loss of life among the soldiers aboard. David Morgan and Lieutenant David Smith arrived overhead, with barely 2 minutes of combat fuel between them. In that sliver of time, Morgan shot down 2 Skyhawks, and Smith shot down a third. The one surviving Argentine pilot, Hector Sanchez, actually had Morgan lined up in his gun sight and pulled the trigger, and nothing happened. His cannon had jammed. Even at the very end, the margins ran against the Argentine flyer. When the shooting stopped, the tally was almost difficult to believe. 28 Sea Harriers had carried the entire burden of fleet air defense. They had destroyed at least 20 enemy aircraft in the air and lost none of their own to an enemy fighter. The handful that were lost fell to ground fire or to accidents in appalling weather, never to the supersonic jets they had been told would dominate them. So return to the question the Argentine pilots kept asking: how did the slow jet beat the fast ones? The answer is not the single clean line that legend prefers. It was not a magic hover trick, and it was not one heroic turning duel after another. The truth is layered, and the layers are what make it real. The Sea Harrier truly could outturn a Mirage in a close fight, because energy in a turn matters more than speed in a straight line, and the British pilots had spent years learning to use that edge. But that edge was the smaller part of the victory. The larger part was a missile that struck from any angle and almost never missed, in the hands of pilots who were better trained for this fight than their opponents. And beneath all of it lay a cruel arithmetic of distance and fuel, a withdrawal of Argentina's fastest fighters after the first bloody day, and attack pilots sent out deaf to the threat, with only minutes to fight before the long, cold flight home. The Argentine airmen could not grasp how the Sea Harriers outturned their jets, because the turning was never really the whole story. They were searching for one explanation: a flaw in their machines or a trick in the enemy's. There was no single trick. There was a small, well-trained force given exactly the right weapon at exactly the right moment, fighting an enemy whom geography had already half defeated before he ever reached the islands. The aircraft that the experts had dismissed as too slow to be a real fighter had just won one of the most one-sided air campaigns in modern history. Years later, the British admiral who commanded the task force put it simply: without the Sea Harriers, he said, the men on the ground would never even have been given the chance to win their war. The little jet that could stop in mid-air had answered every one of its critics, and the men who flew the faster machines spent the rest of their lives knowing they had been beaten not by speed, but by everything speed could not buy: